That's when you look back and you say to people, well, how is America going to do this? How is it going to work? When we say peace through strength, that is originally an American term. And he's looked at it the same way. And so we have had the model, President Trump's had the model, that once we come up with a peace arrangement, a peace deal, then we were going to work and making sure that that's enforceable. It's a good deal. It's a fair deal. Go back to what President Trump said in his UN General Assembly. And I'm going back on history because, you know, remember what the famous poet said, George Santana said, if you forget a history, be prepared to repeat it. Well, we basically go back to the first UN General Assembly speech. President Trump talked about America first. That's all people remember. The second half of that speech was about national sovereignty. And he talked about the sovereignty of nations. And he said quite clearly in that, if a nation fights for its sovereignty, we will be with you. And he's done that. So this is where I said the challenge is, you know, when you say things like that, you put it on the negative, and I put it on the positive. That's there. You know, the last 3 years, or 2 years, the previous administration, the concern that President Trump has, when you look at what happened in Ukraine, he says, well, I want to, you know, we stop the killing. And the level of killing, and we all know this, you're at World War II level of death. When you look at the destruction, let's use the city, somebody made the comment of Mariupol. When you came out of there, that's a city the size of Denver, Colorado. It's the size of Atlanta, Georgia. It's destroyed. When you look at the amount of death and destruction within Ukraine, so when you, which is massive, the level of destruction in Ukraine is it's 3 times the amount of death for the Ukrainians alone that Americans suffered in the Korean War and the Vietnam War combined over 11 years. So my take on this is if you think you can kill your way out of this war, you can't. Okay, it's not just killing alone. It's quite. You're going to have to have with a comprehensive plan, a plan that has worked with the allies, working together, but it's going to be a comprehensive plan. I know, went over my time, and I got you on that one.
It's okay. I'd like to get the response from the Polish foreign minister. You know, we heard this morning the NATO Secretary General basically say to Europe, stop complaining, make a plan. We understand that there will be a summit on Monday. Perhaps you can confirm that. What leverage do you have to get back in the game? What's your plan?
Well, to convince President Putin to become more reasonable, we have to convince him that the price that he would have to pay would be unacceptable. This is a classic colonial war. They usually take a decade. Look at Vietnam, look at Algeria, look at Angola, Afghanistan. Shorter than that is a bonus. Russian economy is starting to suffer. If we convince him that we are not eager to go back to business as usual, that we can sustain it for longer than he, then he'll make a deal. So our plan should be to stay the course, to continue supporting Ukraine and to support Ukraine in its defense for as long as Ukraine is willing to defend itself.
Stay the course without the Americans, or?
We made that clear in our announcement.
Because they don't seem as if they're in it for the long haul. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding the general, but.
Well, I agree with the general that that if it could be ended quickly, of course, everybody wants peace. You know, Putin wants peace, but on his terms. The question is, how do you get to a deal that everybody can live with? And if it can be done faster, great. But in my mind, to get to it faster, you should prepare for the medium term.
The first time I will disagree with Radek. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants war, because for him, war also is an instrument to control his society, to control his country and regions. If we are speaking about true reasons why he wants war.
But if you capitulated, he would have peace, right? So he would prefer not to pay the price.
I'd like to turn to the UK Foreign Secretary. I mean, the UK always likes to say that you have this special relationship with the United States. And through that lens, I'd like to ask you what your plan is right now. Follow Trump, try and build a bridge between the US and the EU, present your own plan.
Let's step back for a moment. It was the US and the UK that 3 years ago presented the global community because of our shared intelligence capability, with a fact that many in Europe said couldn't happen, wouldn't happen, that Putin was about to invade Ukraine. And I was in Ukraine the month before that invasion, and I remember looking at all the faces of those young men and women in Kyiv who had lost their lives, because this story begins back in 2014. Since then, combined as a transatlantic alliance, we have supplied Ukraine with the military capability, with the humanitarian capability and the economic capability to fend off this war. And the bravery, the courage, the innovation in Ukraine, which often doesn't get talked about, the innovation in drone capability has been phenomenal, given that people said this would be over within a week. So that's what we've achieved. Today, there has been a conversation that our American friends have begun. It's talk about talks. There is no negotiated settlement. We know, our assessment is certainly, that Putin has showed no desire to negotiate other than to see a capitulation from our Ukrainian friend, which is something we cannot tolerate. And neither can our American friends tolerate that, because it would send a message to others, let's say Maduro, that, yeah, invade Venezuela. To China, have your imperial ambitions. And so we have to stand up to Putin. We know that. The truth is, in that negotiation, the question is on what terms, one, and two, what are the security guarantees that ensure that Putin does not come back for more, so that we have an enduring peace? And what we know, and it's a bitter pill, was that Minsk didn't work. He breached the OSCE monitoring exercise 20 times. It didn't work. So something's got to be in its place this time that works, and that's why we believe an irreversible pathway to NATO is important to keep on the table.
Minister Sakaliani, how do you see the first steps to providing Ukraine the security guarantees that it needs and that would also make you feel comfortable? I mean, Lithuania, everybody talks about how you are also in Putin's eyes quite closely.
Well, first
Are
of
we
all,
talking about a European army going forward? What would you like to see in the short term, the medium term, the long term? Because Zelensky mentioned a European force this morning.
I think that we are not starting from the most important moment. It's military muscle of Europe. You cannot guarantee security to anyone if you are not strong enough. And therefore, we have all been shaken a bit, I'd say, over the course of past 4 days. I came from Brussels to Munich, and in Brussels I saw a very interesting change in the room full of my colleagues in the course of 24 hours, when from this illusion that the United States are going to defend Europe, we came to a realization that we are going to defend ourselves with the help of the United States. And that's a bit different formula. And therefore, yes, we need to be in the room where negotiations will be, because we are going to bear the consequences as well, and we are going to be a part of it. But talks are just empty words if there is no money on the table. And we will have to put that money on the table now. We have debt of over 7 decades to the United States all over Europe. Okay, our region probably 3 decades, because we were occupied before that. But nevertheless, the United States paid for European security. This debt with interest came to our door right now, and we will have to deal with it if we want to help Ukraine. So security guarantees means that we have to have the capability to guarantee anything. Also to invest in Ukraine. Ukrainian defense industry and European defense industry and United States defense industry is a critical element of guarantee that Mr. Putin, after 2 to 3 years, or however long he will need, but let's not have illusion that it's going to be long, to finalize reform of his army, to continue the production of defense industry, well, in his case, aggression industry in his country, which is fast already. And if we want for ourselves to be strong and for Ukraine to be strong, that means Ukrainians who have technology, engineers, motivation, and they have twice as large capacity for defense production when we have money for it, that means also investing in Ukraine. And that also means that first step is financial instruments for all Europe to borrow as much as we can right now, to make acquisitions as fast as we can right now, to build defense factories as fast as we can now, and also involving defense industry and asking them to change the rules as well. The usual sustainable, careful business building rules no longer apply. We do not probably believe anyone in this room that there can be any sustainable agreement with Mr. Putin which can last long. I agree that Mr. Trump has had and hopefully will have an effect on Mr. Putin. But he is a person who is building his empire. And also I agree completely with Ukrainian colleague. Having a war on his soil is helping him as a dictator to thrive. But also China and Russia are going to combine their actions. And therefore, our ability to have a military muscle will be needed when we will have both Europe and United States to stand against both Russia and China in the next stage, which will come soon.
I think that a lot of the shock that has happened at this conference over the past couple of days is the manner in which the United States has chosen to engage with Putin. And General Kellogg, I'd like to address this to you, because the impression is that the U.S. has already given up leverage to Putin before talks have even started. The EU foreign policy chief actually used the word appeasement. She said it never works. You have previously suggested, and this is also before you were part of the administration and part of this effort, that both sides of the conflict will have to make concessions. What concessions will Putin have to make?
Well, to me, there's going to have to be things like territorial concessions as well. Okay, some of it is unrealistic to expect where you'd want to go to, but it's territorial. It's subterritorial. It could be the engagement of refusing to use force, renouncement of the use of force into the future. From a political side, he's not going to downsize his military forces. Hopefully, get rid of. What we're going to try to do is basically force him into actions. What you want to do is force him to actions maybe he's uncomfortable with. What I mean by that, as an example, right now is what we're going to do is try to break this alliance that he currently has. He's got an alliance around North Korea that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with Iran that wasn't there before. He's got an alliance with China that wasn't there before, meaning 4 years ago before. But let me just pivot real quickly before this, because what is really interesting to me is because now, which I think is very, very important, is how the Atlantic Alliance is coming together. Well, my response to the Atlantic Alliance, well, about time. Glad you showed up. Because we said over 4 years ago, we said it quite clearly, the NATO alliance made a clear declaration in 2014 in Wales that by 2024, they would have 2% of their GDP in defense, of which 20% was modernization. We still have 8 members of NATO who are not there. It took a long time for these nations to get there. Congratulations to the Poles, who are now leading the pack, with their well over 4%, getting to 5% on the defense. But that's a question you want to make, and I understand it.
How? I mean, you said that you're going to force Putin to do things. How exactly are you going to do that? And will it be, because, I mean, Zelensky said this morning, he was very clear, he wants sanctions on the front end, not on the back end. He wants them now.
And
more sanctions,
the challenge
is that on the table?
Well, when you say concessions, of course they're concessions, because both sides are going to have to give. I mean, you cannot say...
No, he wants sanctions. He wants more sanctions against Russia.
Let's use sanctions as an example. I think it's a great example. And it's a great example to use it. And right now, most of the nations out here have sanctions, and we're going to stay on sanctions just for a minute. But one of the sanctions they talked about is what is driving Russia. It's really a petro state. 70% of the money they are getting to fund this war comes out of petro, oil and gas. Most of that is going through the shadow fleet. Most of that shadow fleet, 70% of that fleet, goes through the Baltics. Mm-hmm. We've intercepted 1 or 2 of those vessels. We, the United States, have sanctioned their fleet by name, the USS Kellogg, the USS Sikorsky, whatever out there. And now you come up with a plan when you talk about sanctions. If you rate them on a level of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, we're probably at a 6. But enforcement is about a level 3. So what you say, what does he have to give up? Well, maybe he gives up his oil revenue and we'll force him to do it. Because what you do is you start employing sanctions that break the economic back. We've done this before. We've seen this before. Trump has seen this before. We did it against the Iranians. We nearly broke the Iranians back with economic sanctions and oil sanctions. We turned around and we gave it back to them. So this is a point where you say, what do you do? These are the kind of things you do. If you think, to me, this is just me, if you think you're going to kill your way out of this, you're wrong, because you have a lousy review of history. Because what I mean by that, this is a nation, we're talking about the Russians, that were willing to lose 700,000 in 6 months in the Battle of Stalingrad. They're willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their soldiers in a fight, in a great fight by the Ukrainians. So much so they're bringing in North Koreans. They're not bringing in North Koreans because they think it's a good idea. It's a tell. The tell they're saying is they've got a problem with manning. They've got a problem with soldiers. So you make them pay the price for that. So it's not just one thing. It's just not the metric of saying it's kinetic, military. You've got to balance it all. It's across the board. Too many times what we devolve into, we're saying, well, it's a manning issue. It's a killing issue. It's an aircraft issue with fighter bombers, artillery. It's much more than that. And what we're trying to say is it's got to be a comprehensive plan that ensures that he knows that we're going to snap back things, that there's going to be pressures on him that run across the entire gamut to put him on pressure. Military pressure alone won't do that, because he'll just mobilize. He's pulled tanks out of mothballs. He's pulled tanks out of museums. He can use to bring in North Korean troops. So what do? You attack things other than just kinetic. You don't dismiss that. Right. But you can attack other places as well.
Minister Sikorski, I'd like to ask for your response to that, and also if you can give us a little bit more of a sense of what's happening on the EU level and the conversations that are happening right now that you're taking part in. Because, Zelensky saying that in addition to security guarantees from the United States, at least 200,000 European peacekeepers would be needed to prevent a new Russian attack after any ceasefire. You're the driving force, of course, behind EU discussions on joint financing of defense. You also hold the rotating EU presidency until June. Do you have the feeling right now, because, there's always been this conversation about a common EU defense. Is this the moment right now for the EU? Is this the moment where that's happened? Is the will there from your partners, especially Germany and France?
We've been talking about European defense for decades. There was even a treaty in the 1950s. There were announcements made at the time of the Yugoslav war. Then there were the battle groups. We are now organizing a rapid reaction force, a brigade-size force. We've appointed a EU commissioner for defense and space. But defense is very expensive. It's follow the money is a rule. If we don't devote real resources, it will not be serious. And the resources have to come from somewhere. And the list of sources is limited, either from higher contributions by member states, or from unspent funds from the COVID bonds, or new defense bonds, or perhaps a rearmament bank modeled on the EBRD, but devoted specifically to nurturing a European defense revival. Whether we do this depends on whether people are scared enough. You've noticed that people spend more on defense the closer we are to Russia. But if we recognize that Putin is a threat to all of Europe, then it is not fair for us, border countries of Europe, to be landed with the entire cost of defending more comfortable countries and richer countries to our west from this common threat, which is why it makes sense to share the burden through the European budget. We have a defense budget. It is called the European Peace Facility, where we contribute in proportion to GDP. Unfortunately, disbursements from it are being blocked by one European country, Hungary. And I hope General Keller can help us to persuade Hungary to stop blocking these disbursements, because times have become really dire. We have a leader who has appointed himself as someone who can decide who is a nation and who isn't, who has broken taboos established by two bloody civil world wars, that thou shalt not change borders by force. So yes, I do believe that the the hour has come to treat European defense seriously.
Secretary Lemmy, you have been quite skeptical about Putin's intentions, as you've highlighted earlier. It's interesting to note that he's not talking about compromise, actually, at this point. He's talking about his concerns being recognized. That's the language that's been coming out of the Kremlin. And through that lens, I'd like to ask you, how do you see Putin not walking away a victor if a ceasefire or a peace deal is brokered?
Well, this is where we learn from our shared history and shared understanding. It was an American diplomat, George Kennan, who wrote a long telegram back to the United States that begun the foreign policy of containment of Russia. And in crafting that policy, which was a shared policy, we understood two things. We understood, and sadly Putin is indicative of this, there is a Tsarist tradition that he's leaning into, Peter the Great, Nicholas I, the worst of that period, imperial in its ambitions, and there is a Soviet tradition. Let's remember he's a KGB agent, he's a man of deception, and in negotiating with him, we have to understand that and relate to that. And of course, what we know is it's usually war that stops that ambition. To the south, the Crimean War. To the east, the Russian war with Japan. And to the west, the Cold War. And we should be deadly serious about those imperial ambitions. And I said in the House of Commons, as someone whose ancestors faced down imperialism, that we have to be real about that threat, which is why Radek is right, and our American friends are right, and have been right since Roosevelt, about European spending. And despite all that we have done, and it's now the case in Europe that we are spending 53% of the money on military effort is coming from Europe, 60% of the humanitarian aid is coming from Europe, but we will need to do more. Because combined across our GDP, it's about 0.1%. We can do better and must do better over this next period if we are to face down Putin. And that's the basis on which we go into negotiations, understanding the sharp lens of history.
We have just a few minutes left. I'm, of course, going to give you the last word. But first, I'd like to turn to the defense minister from Lithuania to give us your last final thoughts. And I mean, you know, your comment on it, how concerned are you that, you know, we might be looking at competing visions, actually, for what might happen in Ukraine? How concerned are you that, you know, about Ukraine's voice being heard in all of this?
I'm actually mostly concerned about what we are going to do and how fast are we going to do that. So regarding support to Ukraine, I completely agree with Secretary Lamy that we need to agree that our support is measured not by words, but by money and guns. So Lithuania gave 0.25% GDP last year, and we are going to keep the pace. Really, EU can do 0.25% GDP as a brink, at least. But secondly, what are we going to do about us being a credible partner and being able to give any security guarantees? So again, we are a small country. We have now 4% GDP for defense, and we will have from 5 to 6% GDP to defense from 2026 to 2030. And that's not an easy decision. And we are a social democratic government. Nobody expected us to do that on the actually second day of our appointment to change those rules. But what we understand is that Mr. Putin is not going to change that the Tsarist and Soviet tradition, which I know on my family. I mean, I come from a family that was imprisoned, tortured, and murdered by Soviets. But at the same time, I understand that if we are absolutely and fully prepared for this imperialist war that Putin is planning to wage, then this is our only chance to avoid it. And that's what we need to do. And then we are able to help Ukraine. Otherwise, it's just talk.
What do you think of all the talk we've heard on this panel?
Interesting. Probably with most of the suggestions, ideas, I agree. But let me summarize. Transatlantic and Ukrainian security are indivisible. As never before, we need unity and strength. We have a very simple recipe how to end this war this year to achieve just, comprehensive, long-lasting peace. Leadership of the United States. President Trump says, if strong America, if America is strong, peace is at peace. The world is in peace. So that's why our approach, active, proactive engagement of United States really could give new dynamics, and we do really believe in this, and we are ready to discuss deeply with our American partners how to proceed. We are looking forward for the visit of General Kellogg to Ukraine, a very important visit. And what is important, and President Zelensky mentioned in today's speech, we should coordinate our positions before we will approach to Russia. Now about recipe, once again. Leadership of the USA to raise the price for further aggression to Russia. Sanctions, frozen assets, price of the oil. So we have these very effective instruments. And the last point, to strengthen Ukraine, to strengthen our position, and we are ready to keep our resistance.
Thank you. That concludes the panel portion of this. We have an absolutely packed room, and we're going to have a microphone going around. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand. We will get to you. And I'm just going to look around the room. Tikhanovskaya, please.
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Belarus. Today, President Zelensky said that the eastern borders of Europe must lay to the eastern border of Belarus as well. So my question is to General Kellogg and all the panelists. How we make sure that Belarus will not be given as cancellation prize to Putin? And what is your policy towards illegitimate Lukashenko, who is continuing to conduct terror and direct our country into the war, and to Putin? Thank you.
General Kellogg.
Let me sure I got the question right. How do we prevent further escalation? Cuts down to the right.
Will Belarus be used in this as a pawn in a geopolitical game?
Well, they already are.
As a bargaining chip.
Well, they already are. Belarus has already been used as a pawn. I mean, when you look at it, it's some of the attacks basically emanated, and fortunately there was a lot of resistance within Belarus, and it's a weak partner, but it's still a partner of Russia right now. When you talk about expansion of it, I think what you have to do is like anything else, and it sounds, because we're now talking almost in a large general context, you can't appease aggression, okay? And that's the reason I keep coming back to the challenge. As I said, with this administration, and probably the question was, what did you talk about last year here? What did you talk about the year before here and time before? But that's my challenge to everybody here, is I said, look, you cannot show me where we allowed aggression within a Trump administration for 4 years. You can't. You can't do it in Syria when they used nerve gas. You can't do it when they used ISIS, which at that time was the size geographically of Great Britain. You can't say the same thing about Iran with Soleimani. You can't say the same thing when we made sure things happened all over the world. This was a man who said, if you attack an American in his last State of the Union, if you attack, not kill, if you attack an American, your life is forfeit. And months after that, we put an entire SEAL team, our best special forces, into one country, in Niger and Africa, and it's illustrated, to get one individual who was kidnapped by bandits. And we were willing to do that. So the point is, you almost have to trust the man and trust the discussion. What you were talking about is what has happened in the past history. And somebody said before that, with the invasion of Crimea and before, what's the past history? Don't put that on us. Okay, this kind of goes back on you, on the European environment. But we have a track record, the Trump administration, of 4 years of what's happening. We've been in power, the president has been in power for 25 days. 25 days. But we made very clear that this war must come to an end. That is not what you heard from the last administration. You know, to me, the last administration said, and I know I'm veering away from a little bit what you asked, but as long as it takes, as much as it takes, that's a bumper sticker. That's not a strategy. At least come up with a strategy to do that. And I see Senator Wicker in the audience, who runs our great Senate Armed Services Committee, and he knows, because when I went to Ukraine last time, I went in front of his committee and I explained, this is the way you have to do it. And the explanation I gave to him was that was peace through strength.
When will we know what the Trump plan is?
Well,
What's the time frame?
We're 25 days. I mean, maybe if you give us within 30 days, we might.
Well, he's already called Putin.
Yeah,
He's called Putin. So.
Well, that's pretty good considering that Biden didn't call Putin for 3 years. Okay? And the fact of the matter, the way you like it or not, you have to talk to adversaries and friends as well. You know, when you think about it, it was, I had a great Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, once say, I may not like this son of a bitch, but I got to talk to him. Well, the fact of the matter is that's there. But I think don't put on the problems of the last 3 years, which was accepted on us when we've been there for 25 years. Go back and look at it.
We're going to take another question. So we have a number of hands right here.
Maria Ivanova, member of the Parliament, Ukrainian Parliament, European Solidarity. Dear General Kalak, just for your information that the Russian aggression has been started in 2014. 16,000 Ukrainians have been killed by Russian army. And that is why before 2022. And that is why, of course, we really thanks for all the support you have done. But don't make Putin great again, because we see what is going on when in such messages detoxing Putin and detoxing North Korea, Iran, and all other authoritarian regime. So please make democracy great again. And here we are together with Europeans can make it together, because we are fighting for 11 years and we are ready to fight further together with Europeans and together with you. That is why my question is, your strategy is to stop the war or to win the war? Thank you.
And can I just... Go ahead.
Well, I think the question is, what does winning look like? And I think you have to ask that yourselves. This question. That's a Ukrainian question, because you're fighting for your survival. By the way, let's be totally honest about it. So, the Ukrainians have fought valiantly. What you have done, the sacrifice you've made is incredible. And I've been to Ukraine, and I've been pretty far east and seen Izum and places like that, and I know what you've done and what you've gone through. And I think it's one of those, but the first thing you've got to do is, like I said to somebody earlier today, it's like when you're treating a casualty in war as a soldier, the first thing you do is you stop the bleeding, and then you treat for shock. But the first thing you've got to do is stop the bleeding, because you cannot sustain levels like this. And that doesn't mean you don't, you make it a steel porcupine or make it the Sparta of Middle Europe, whatever it's going to be. And that should be well thought through. But I think part of the question is, if you keep fighting, or do you want to set, this is it for the long term, we want to do it. I remember going back with Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany. He wanted to unify Germany. Without question he did. But he looked over the long term, and he said, maybe this is what we look like. When you look at the Baltic states, which were subjugated by the Soviet Union after World War II, the United States never recognized that. It was called the Wells Doctrine. And we said, you can occupy the land, but we as the United States, we do not acknowledge the fact that this is your territory at all. So this is one of those when saying, okay, this is part of the process. We have to figure out, what does it look like? If you're thinking about victory in World War II terms, of signing a peace treaty on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor, that is probably not going to happen. But you have to look at it a little bit differently for the long term. And that's what we want to do. We want to send the message that aggression is not acceptable, and that the freedom and sovereignty of a nation is acceptable, and that's what we want. And those are the hard questions we have to ask. We have to address it. We can't run from it. But we also cannot be, I believe, from the west and from the east or north and the south, we cannot be Pollyannish about it. You cannot hope for it. Okay? Hope's not a method. It doesn't work. So the reality is, where do you get to? And part of it is we want to make sure that there's a sovereign, stable, successful state of Ukraine. That's the big one. And we obviously, that is done through stopping Russian aggression. We understand that. But the final details of that are something that has to be worked out, will be worked out. And one of the people who have to do that is your president, President Zelensky, and in getting them together, whether you like it or not. Adversaries have to talk.
We have to move on to the next question. We have many. Here you go.
One for you.
Thank you, Bob Dane from the Klingendahl Institute. General, you're being asked quite a lot of questions. Thank you for interacting
go
with
to
us.
somebody else is quite all right.
Much appreciated. Now, I have a question as a military man, because the ceasefire is going to be incredibly difficult. We know from the previous ceasefires, the Minsk agreements, I used to work for the OSCE, that was violated almost every single day for a period of 8 years. And this line of contact is much longer. And as a military man, you know well that the complexity of these weapon systems, artillery, drones. Do you have some idea already on what will be needed even to monitor and enforce such a ceasefire? And what happens if it's violated?
And I would
Thank
just
you very much.
Yeah, and I would like to also add to that. You know, you have, first of all, what security guarantees is the United States willing to provide to Ukraine? And there's a bit of a dilemma here, because you have on the one hand Zelensky saying that if you're not willing to provide security guarantees and the EU can't fill the gap, then he wants an army of 1.5 million. They have about, I think, 800,000 right now. And Putin, that's an absolute no-go for him. How are you going to handle that in any sort of negotiation to get them the guarantees that they need to secure some sort of lasting peace?
Well, one of them is, I kind of alluded to it, and I'll go back to it. But the first is, to be very candid with you, I do not speak for the President of the United States. The President of the United States speaks for himself, okay? And I will not say that this is a decision of the United States. I got 0 electoral college votes this year, okay? I got no votes, right? He did. He's the President. His commander-in-chief under our Constitution, he makes those calls. He'll make those calls. We as advisors make recommendations. And so when I say this is what they'll be, I don't know what they'll be, because that's his call, not my call. When it comes to violations, that's what I made to earlier, is this is when I say you have to take a measure. And historically, if you do it, you're good. How do you respond to a violation or a ceasefire? We have proven that. Donald Trump has proven that. That's where he made that comment about using SEAL Team 6 for one American farmer that was captured and taken prisoner in Niger, and we sent an entire Special Operations SEAL team from Dam Neck, Virginia, all the way into Africa and respond. That's why we responded on a nerve gas attack against Assad by putting 71 Tomahawk land attack missiles in there. The response is immediate, it's violent, it's overwhelming. That's how you respond to ceasefires. You don't respond to ceasefires by going, gee, that's okay, okay? And the measure of the man, and I've seen it happen in 4 years, is a willingness, the willingness to use force, because that's a key part of deterrence. Because what you're asking about is, on a violation of a ceasefire, is how do you establish deterrence? You can have all the capability in the world that you want, but if you don't have the will to do that and the will to execute, then it means absolutely nothing. And ceasefires mean nothing.
Okay, we're going to take another question. Yeah.
I just want to make this point on behalf of Ukraine. We have a shared responsibility, because it was us as allies that encouraged Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. And I know that there is a discussion in Ukraine that had they not done that, they would not be in this situation. The truth is, when you look around the world in different conflict zones, there are different security guarantees. The United States effectively has security guarantees with Japan, with South Korea. There's Article 5 with Israel. There are different security arrangements. This is a long border. There is drone capability, which we learn from, that can provide some of that guarantee. But in the end, what I think we'll be thinking about, and I know we're thinking about, is what does Russia fear? What stops them breaching the guarantee? And that is the detail. That is an alliance we're getting into. And of course, Ukraine will want that guarantee. And even if they were to be admitted to NATO, there is a path. They would need those guarantees even before that irreversible pathway that we set out back in September.
Okay. I'd just like to explain, because we're also streaming this on YouTube Live, why the General is getting so many questions from the audience. Here at the Munich Security Conference, we've heard a lot from the Americans, but this has actually been the only conversation that a member of the current administration is engaging in, both in a panel setting and also taking questions from the audience. So that's why this conversation has been dominated in that way. There's one more question here, and then this is the final question.
Thank you very much. Pavel Popescu from Romania. General Kellogg. I remember, definitely, yeah. I remember the meeting we had 3 years ago when we were discussing about these topics. First Trump administration, President Trump said lots of things which Europe didn't like. Lots. He said lots of things that Europe didn't like in the first administration. And he was right. We like it or not, he was right a lot about a lot of things we had to do right. We have to acknowledge that. Second Trump administration, we leave it now. We see the same style, we see the same type of requests, but we see something that we've seen these days here. It's an elephant in the room. We see parallel with the same requests like in the first Trump administration, some direct and non-direct signs in supporting right extreme parties in Europe, which, by the way, are voting in our parliaments against the defense spending. In my country, the presidential candidate, and I was the head of the National Security and Defense Committee, voting for the $6.5 billion spend of F-35s to defend my country first, and because of our strategic partnership. In my country, a candidate spoke against that contract, addressing people that this is a very bad thing to spend money on F-35s for our defense. My question is, how will you deal with this kind of narrative while you will try to convince Europe? And I agree, we should be convinced we should do more about that. And I'm a big fan of that. But how will you address this challenge while supporting the voices which got the vote because they don't want to spend money on defense?
Well,
Thank you very much.
I think I think when you talk about issues like that, that's your issue, not our issue. It's just sort of like what was happened today and I'll give you an example. It's a parallel issue. When I was asked about Ukrainian elections today, I said, they said, that's the issue for the Ukrainian people. The same issue, that's the reason why, as a democracy, you get a chance to vote about it. And it's one of those things where I think there's a cautionary note that one of our founders of our Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, was asked a question when he came out of our Constitutional Convention. He said, Mr. Franklin, what have you given it? What have you given us? And his response was, a republic, if you can keep it. So I think this is one of those, that's a question that you need to ask yourselves internally to every one of your nations. That's not a question you should ask the United States. Everybody's can chip in on the side. They do. We will. You will. But this is one that I think you have to answer yourself, not to me.
Minister Sevilla, I would like to ask you to have the final word, to bring it all together for us. What are the next steps for Ukraine? This morning when we heard from Zelensky, he said that he was essentially available for a meeting with Trump. He was asking for it emphatically. What comes next in the next days and months for you?
So first, I would like to confirm that David has a right to speak on behalf of Ukraine, definitely. And you deserve this right. So once again, unity and strength. We do really have a chance to end this war this year by demonstrating strength, by implementing concept which was also announced by President Trump, peace through strength. We have clear understanding how we could proceed with this. We need support of the United States. We need to coordinate our efforts. and probably to predict, to prevent such a situation when we were not aware about something about us. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. We will never accept any initiative which was elaborated without us. We could not expect easy
How would your non-acceptance look?
We know how to resist. You see, we prove this at the battlefield also. So we do really believe that we could get new dynamics in our peace efforts. And we are ready for this.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for Peace Through Strength, the plan for Ukraine. This has been a conflict zone from the Munich Security Conference. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, Foreign Minister.
My pleasure.
Yeah, really a pleasure to speak with you. And I look forward